Some children grow up in homes where nobody screams at them, nobody hits them, nobody abandons them physically, and yet they still grow up feeling invisible, not because they were alone, but because nobody truly saw them. Nobody noticed when they went quiet. Nobody asked why they suddenly stopped smiling. Nobody realized they were slowly teaching themselves that their feelings did not matter. And the terrifying part is, many people carry this trauma for years without even realizing it happened. They just call themselves sensitive, or emotionally needy, or hard to love. But what if the real wound started much earlier than that? What if you learned to disappear before you even knew who you were? Imagine a child sitting in a crowded living room. The TV is loud, people are talking, life is happening all around them. But inside that child's mind, something painful is forming. They want to speak. They want comfort. They want someone to notice the sadness sitting quietly behind their eyes. But every time they try, they are interrupted, dismissed, ignored, told they are too emotional, too dramatic, too sensitive. So eventually, they stop trying. Not because the pain disappeared, but because they learned something dangerous. My emotions are inconvenient, and children who learn this early often become adults who apologize for existing, adults who over-explain themselves, adults who fear being a burden, adults who sit in rooms full of people while secretly feeling completely alone. Maybe that's why some people become addicted to validation, not attention, validation. There's a difference. Attention says, I notice you. Validation says, you matter. And when a child grows up emotionally unseen, they spend years searching for proof that they matter to someone. Pause for a moment. Think about how many times you said, I'm fine, when you really wanted someone to ask a second time. Not because you wanted pity, but because part of you still hopes someone will finally notice what you learned to hide. That's the invisible trauma. It doesn't always leave bruises. Sometimes it leaves silence. Sometimes it creates the person who never asks for help, the person who acts strong all the time, the friend everyone depends on emotionally, but nobody checks on, because when you grow up unseen, you become excellent at hiding pain. You learn how to smile while disconnecting emotionally, how to comfort others while neglecting yourself, how to become useful instead of understood. And eventually, you stop knowing the difference between being loved and being needed. A lot of emotionally unseen children become hyper-aware adults. They notice every shift in tone, every delayed text, every tiny facial expression. Because growing up, their emotional safety depended on reading the room correctly. They learned to monitor people constantly. Is mom in a good mood today? Is dad stressed? Should I stay quiet right now? Should I make myself smaller? So their nervous system adapted, not for peace, for survival. And years later, this shows up as overthinking. People think overthinking is just thinking too much. But often, it's an old survival strategy. Because when your emotions were ignored as a child, your brain learned this. If I can predict everything, maybe I can finally feel safe. That's why some people replay conversations for hours, why they fear disappointing others, why rejection feels catastrophic. It's not weakness, it's unresolved emotional invisibility. And here's something most people never realize. Children don't need perfect parents, they just need emotional presence. A child can survive mistakes, they can survive imperfections. But what deeply wounds them is feeling emotionally alone while standing right next to the people who are supposed to protect them. Some parents provide food, shelter, clothes, education, but never emotional connection. They respond to achievements, not emotions. So the child slowly learns, I am valuable when I perform. And this creates adults who tie their worth to productivity, adults who feel guilty resting, adults who panic when they fail, adults who secretly believe they must earn love. Maybe you've seen this before. The person who achieves everything, yet still feels empty. The person who constantly helps others, yet secretly feels emotionally starving. The person who says, I don't need anyone, when deep down, they desperately wish someone would stay. Here's the strange part about growing up unseen. Many people don't recognize it as trauma because nothing big happened. No dramatic story, no obvious abuse, just years of emotional absence. And emotional absence is difficult to explain because it's about what didn't happen. The hugs that never came, the conversations that never happened, the comfort that never arrived. Sometimes trauma is not about painful experiences. Sometimes trauma is about missing experiences, missing safety, missing reassurance, missing emotional warmth. And the human mind does something heartbreaking when these needs go unmet. It blames itself. If nobody sees me, maybe I'm not worth seeing. That belief becomes dangerous because children carry it into adulthood without questioning it. Then one day they become adults who stay in toxic relationships because being ignored feels familiar. Adults who tolerate emotional neglect because part of them mistakes it for love. Adults who shrink themselves to avoid rejection, not realizing they learned this pattern long ago. Pause again for a second. What if your constant need to prove yourself was never actually about ambition? What if it was a younger version of you still trying to finally be noticed? That changes everything, because suddenly your behaviors start making sense. The people-pleasing, the emotional exhaustion, the fear of vulnerability, the discomfort with receiving love. It was never random, it was adaptation, and adaptations that protect us in childhood often imprison us in adulthood. But there's another side to this story. People who grew up unseen often develop incredible emotional depth. They become deeply empathetic, emotionally intelligent, compassionate, because they know exactly what loneliness feels like. They become the people who notice others, the people who remember small details, the people who check in when someone suddenly goes quiet. Why? Because they know what it feels like when nobody does. But sometimes, they give so much emotional care to others that they forget they deserve the same care too. And that's where healing begins. Not in becoming someone new, but in finally giving yourself what you needed all along: attention, compassion, emotional permission. The permission to feel without apologizing for it. Healing from emotional invisibility is strange, because at first it feels uncomfortable to be seen. Compliments feel suspicious, love feels temporary, vulnerability feels dangerous. You may even push people away without understanding why, because part of you still expects emotional abandonment, still expects people to lose interest, still expects your feelings to become too much. But healing slowly teaches the nervous system something new. You do not have to disappear to be loved. And maybe that sentence alone changes someone's life today. The invisible trauma of growing up unseen doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, through anxiety, through overthinking, through emotional numbness, through the constant feeling that you are somehow not enough. But the moment you finally understand where these feelings came from, something powerful happens. You stop viewing yourself as broken and start seeing yourself as someone who adapted to emotional loneliness the best way they could. That realization brings compassion, and compassion is often the beginning of healing. Maybe nobody noticed your pain when you were younger. Maybe nobody asked the questions you desperately needed someone to ask. But that does not mean your emotions were unimportant. It does not mean your wounds were imaginary. And it definitely does not mean you were hard to love. You were a child trying to survive emotional darkness without a map, and the fact that you are still here, still trying to understand yourself, still searching for healing, means something inside you never gave up. Maybe that part deserves to finally be seen.